It forgets stretched skin. It forgets punishments designed not to kill but to remind people of their place. And that forgetting is dangerous because it allows the same mechanisms to continue operating under different names. So what practical medieval survival strategies can we extract from the skin stretcher's existence? First, understand that visibility attracts punishment in systems that demand conformity. This doesn't mean complete invisibility is always the answer. Sometimes strategic visibility serves important purposes, but it means calculating the risks, understanding when attracting attention serves your goals, and when it just makes you a target. Second, recognize that trauma isn't less real because it doesn't leave visible scars. The skin stretcher worked precisely because it exploited this gap. Authorities could claim mercy while inflicting lasting psychological damage. Understanding this helps you advocate for yourself and others whose suffering isn't immediately visible. Third, document everything. The reason we know about the skin stretcher at all is because some witnesses, horrified by what they saw, wrote descriptions despite official silence. When institutions want to hide their cruelty, documentation becomes resistance. Fourth, build community. Marta stood alone in that square because isolation made her vulnerable. Women who survived medieval persecution often did so through networks of mutual protection, sharing information, providing alibis, helping each other flee when necessary. Collective action creates safety. Individual resistance can't achieve. Fifth, understand that compliance doesn't guarantee safety. Some women rendered themselves completely invisible and still got accused when authorities needed someone to punish. Perfect obedience is impossible, and attempting it destroys you anyway. Better to calculate risks strategically than to sacrifice everything hoping institutional power will leave you alone. Sixth, recognize when systems are designed to make you complicit in your own oppression. The skin stretcher didn't just punish Marta, it trained her to punish herself through changed behavior and internalized fear. Anytime you find yourself restricting your own behavior, not because you want to, but because you're afraid of consequences, you're experiencing the same mechanism. Identifying this pattern is the first step to resisting it. Seventh, remember that survival and resistance aren't opposites. The women who survived medieval beauty-related persecution weren't all submissive victims. Many found ways to maintain dignity, express identity, support each other just more carefully than before. Survival doesn't require complete surrender if you're strategic about where and how you resist. The skin stretcher asks uncomfortable questions that remain relevant. How many forms of control survive simply because they don't look violent? How many modern mechanisms operate through psychological pressure rather than physical force, making them harder to identify and resist? How many lessons from the past are still tightening slowly, invisibly around us? When we police women's appearance, shame bodies that don't conform, create hostile environments for people who dare to be visible, we're operating the same machinery, just with different terminology. The frame has been rebuilt in 1,000 new forms. Understanding how it worked historically helps us recognize it operating today. Marta's story, whether she was a real person or a composite representing hundreds of women who experienced similar punishments, matters because it preserves knowledge that authorities wanted erased. The skin stretcher was designed to leave no evidence, to traumatize without documentation, to control through mechanisms that seemed reasonable to contemporary observers, just correcting vanity, just maintaining order, just protecting morality. Every woman who walked away from that device, bearing invisible scars, carried a lesson authorities wanted taught, but didn't want discussed. The lesson that your body isn't yours. That beauty is dangerous. That pride requires punishment. That visibility invites destruction. But Marta, walking through the square afterward with changed posture and hidden hair, also taught a different lesson to anyone paying attention. Systems that require this level of violence to maintain control are fragile. They're admitting through their cruelty that they can't convince people voluntarily that women would choose beauty, pride, visibility, if given the option. That obedience must be beaten and stretched and burned into bodies because it won't be adopted willingly. This is important for survival, recognizing that institutions employing torture have already lost the intellectual argument. They're resorting to force because persuasion failed. That doesn't make them less dangerous, if anything. It makes them more so, but it reveals weakness beneath the display of power. Medieval survival meant understanding power's weaknesses, as well as its strengths. Knowing that authorities who seemed omnipotent actually depended on public compliance, that systems requiring constant violence to maintain order were inherently unstable. That even brutal punishments couldn't completely control human behavior. They could only make certain behaviors more costly. Women continued finding ways to express beauty despite the risks. Men continued noticing despite religious doctrine claiming desire was sin. Communities continued protecting members despite official demands for reporting. The skin stretcher existed because simpler methods of control had failed. It was escalation, not evidence of strength. Subscribe to Medieval Survival Skills because understanding how historical control mechanisms operated isn't academic curiosity, it's practical knowledge for recognizing when similar patterns emerge today. The skin stretcher teaches us that cruelty often disguises itself as concern, that punishment claims to be correction, that control presents itself as protection. Learning to see through these disguises, to recognize violence even when it's been sanitized and justified. Is survival skill applicable to any era where certain bodies are treated as public property requiring regulation? Marta's invisible scars remind us that trauma doesn't need to be visible to be real. That psychological violence can be as damaging as physical. That systems relying on shame and fear to maintain order deserve resistance. The skin stretcher didn't survive into the modern era, not because we became enlightened, but because control learned subtlety. Direct torture became bad publicity. But the impulse to regulate bodies, particularly female bodies, through pain and humiliation, that impulse adapted, found new methods, new justifications. The frame was dismantled, but the logic persists. Certain people's bodies are public concern, subject to correction, requiring discipline when they refuse to conform. Understanding this continuity, seeing the line connecting medieval torture devices to modern body policing, is essential for both historical understanding and contemporary survival. So honor Marta and the women like her by learning their lessons. By recognizing when beauty becomes dangerous because power feels threatened. By understanding that visibility carries risks in systems demanding conformity. By building networks of mutual protection. By documenting abuses that authorities want, hidden. By resisting strategically rather than self-destructively. By remembering that survival and dignity aren't mutually exclusive if you're smart about where and how you fight. The skin stretcher was designed to make women accomplices in their own oppression, to turn bodies into prisons through internalized fear. Refuse that transformation. Your body is yours, your beauty, if you choose to cultivate it. Isn't a crime? And any system that requires torture devices to maintain control has already admitted its own illegitimacy. Remember that when modern equivalents appear, when pressure to conform intensifies, when visibility attracts punishment, the frame was dismantled. The impulse behind it never left. Medieval survival skills exists to teach recognition of these patterns and strategies for navigating systems that treat certain bodies as problems requiring correction. Subscribe. Learn. Remember, because some mechanisms of control are still operating, they just learn to hide better.